Welcome to Grain and Steel. So today we're going to be working on another epoxy project. I'm going to be doing 2 serving trays that are both going to be 20 by 20. So first we're going to start off by making the mold, and since they're both going to be 20 by 20, I ended up deciding to just make one big mold that was just over 40 by 20, so that once it's cured I can just cut it in half and I didn't have to make 2 separate molds for essentially the same serving tray. So first we started off at the table saw and we ripped everything to the proper widths, and then we headed over to the circular saw and we cut everything to length. And the next step would be to tape all of your pieces of your mold. And the reason you do that is you're going to spray mold release on all of these pieces so that nothing sticks. When everything's finally cured, you can just take it right out of the mold, no problems. The next step is to finally construct your mold. And there are 2 main keys to making sure that you have a good mold. Key 1 is that you have a really intense focus face. If you don't do that, then you might have some leakage. Now, the actual first thing is that you have to make sure to pre-drill every single hole so that you don't end up splitting the wood. And then the other thing is to make sure you use the right screws. Now, I like to use cabinet screws because they have those flat heads, and I just feel like it leaves no room for anything to leak out. Now we got to grab the silicone and make sure to seal every single gap we see. And make sure to be very thorough here just because you do not want that epoxy dripping through the cracks. It's a huge pain to clean up and it's a big waste of money. So just do yourselves a favor and take your time. The way that I usually do this is I usually do one big thick pass and then I wait about maybe 30 minutes for it to dry, and then I come back and I fill any little gaps that are still left. So now it's time for the planing / cleanup process for this wood. And the wood that I used for this project is called Kiave. So this wood comes from Hawaii, and it's actually predominantly used as firewood, which came as a surprise to me just because it looks so cool, and it's incredibly durable as well. So before this wood's actually ready for the mold, we have to make sure we remove all the bark from the edges and remove any soft woods that we find in the center of the wood. So to remove the bark, we use a wire wheel on our drill, and we just keep going over it until it's pretty much all gone. As far as the softwoods are concerned, I kind of just use a chisel and I just keep chiseling away until it's all gone, which is definitely a lengthy process, but it is super necessary. Now, my slabs were definitely way bigger than the mold that I made, so what I did was I set my slabs on top of the mold, and then I drew lines where I needed to cut the slabs so that they would fit. So now we're ready for the circular saw, and I made my cuts at the lines that I marked, and this is what it looks like when the slabs finally fit into the mold. So here we're just spraying our mold with some mold release before we pour our epoxy, and this will prevent any sticking when our epoxy is finally cured and we go to take it out of the mold. Now I don't know what happened to the footage of the very first epoxy pour here, but here it is anyways. And unlike my past projects, I am using tabletop epoxy for this project, so I knew that that first layer was pretty much going to get planed off anyways, so I didn't even bother putting any swirls in it yet. So we're ready for the second pour, but before you do that, you have to make sure to scuff up your first pour with some sandpaper. And the reason you do this is just so that the second pour bonds properly with the first pour, and we will continue to do this with every single layer moving forward. Once you pour your epoxy, a bunch of little bubbles will appear at the surface, and you can just go back with a flame torch like I am here and pop all those little bubbles, which is super satisfying. Now for every layer moving forward, I am going to be swirling white pigment into this black epoxy. And I knew the white pigment was going to look good in the black epoxy, but I wasn't sure how it was going to look when I did it in layers. But I had a plan, so I just trusted the process, and you're going to see how it looks in the end. So now that our epoxy is finally cured, we're ready to remove it from the mold. So the first thing you got to do is remove every screw, and then you just grab a hammer and hit all the borders off. Then the next step would be to use a pry bar, or even a chisel sometimes works, and you just pry your workpiece off of the base. Now we're ready to surface our piece so it's nice and flat, and I definitely learned my lesson on this one. I would probably rather just charge a little bit more for my work and hire a shop to surface it for me, just because the amount of time and effort I put into this one step almost made the entire project not worth it. So maybe just keep that in mind for yourself. The other thing about flattening with a router sled is that it does definitely leave lines at the end, so you do have to come back with a hand planer like I did, or just use your sander, which I'm also doing here. Now, don't hold your breath on this step because sanding will take hours no matter what you do, so just be patient. Our piece is now smooth enough to cut it down to size, so I'm going to cut all the edges off, and then I'm going to cut it right down the middle so we have our 2 separate serving trays. And when you are cutting things to their final dimensions, just make sure that you use some sort of guide like I am here. Don't just make a line and try to follow it with the circular saw because it will never be perfect. And especially if someone's paying you to do a project, you want to make sure it is as perfect as it can possibly be. Now, after making your cuts with a circular saw, it sometimes leaves little saw blade marks. So I am going back and sanding the edges, and you don't actually need this kind of sander to do this. You can just sand it by hand, and that works just fine. So originally for the edge profile for this project, I was going to use a roundover bit on my router, but the customer did request that these serving trays were a 1/2 inch thick, which I felt was just a little bit too thin for us to use the router bit. So I ended up just using sandpaper and rounding off those corners by hand. Now it's time to just make these surfaces as perfect as possible. So I go back and fill any little imperfections I see, and especially if there are any cracks or anything like that, I will go back and fill them with CA glue, not only to make sure that everything looks good, but to make sure that nothing ends up breaking in the future. And I didn't show myself sanding again just because it's super monotonous, but I did end up sanding all the way up to 320 grit just before we went to apply our finish. Now I'm about ready to apply the finish, so I have to clean everything off with isopropyl alcohol. And then we can go ahead and grab our Odie's oil and start mixing and apply a couple of dabs to our workpiece. And now we just use a white pad and rub it in super thoroughly and make sure not to miss any spots. And just make sure to finish both sides in one go, just so that you don't end up with any warping or anything like that. And you just leave your workpiece with the finish on it for about an hour or so, and then you just come back with the towel and you rub it all off, and then once you think you're done rubbing it off, continue rubbing it off for another 5 minutes or so. Okay, questionable word choice there, rubbing it off. Removing excess finish. There we go. So this is what the trays looked like once the finish was applied, and now we're ready to put the handles on. So the first thing I did off camera was I measured my handles and I made sure to mark my workpiece so I knew where to drill my holes. Then I just drilled the first hole and went ahead and screwed the first side of the handle in. Then I just lined up where the second hole needs to be and I drilled that hole and I screwed that side in. And there really isn't that much to that process, so I just repeated that same thing for the other 3 handles. And now we're ready to put the protective pads on the underside of the serving trays. So I'm just making sure to clean the bottoms of the trays first so that everything sticks properly. And now I just grab the pads and I apply a couple of dabs of CA glue on the bottoms of them, and then I hold them firmly against the bottom of the workpiece for about 30 seconds so that they dry. Here's what the pads look like once they've been put on. And I did make sure not to put the pads too close to the edges, just because I feel like if you have pads sticking out of the sides, it almost looks like it wasn't very well thought out. So although the pad placement may seem trivial, it could make things look wonky if you don't place them in the right spot, so just be very deliberate in where you place them. So here is the grand reveal of the serving trays. I think they turned out amazing, and those layered swirls gave them so much depth, and I'd never done them like that before, so I was really just happy to see that that worked out. Other than that, if you did like this video, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment and let me know what you thought of the serving trays. If you're interested in me making something for you, get in contact with me through Etsy or Instagram, both of which will be linked in the description. So with that out of the way, I hope you guys really liked this video, and I'll see you in the next one.